The day was scorching hot, the sun beating down relentlessly on the earth, leaving no hope for relief. The park was crowded with people, some strolling with children, others sunbathing, while a few simply enjoyed the summer day. Here, in this vast green corner of the city, one could forget about all their troubles and just be themselves. But for the park guard, this place was about power. It was a place where he felt he could dictate the rules. He wasn't just a guard here, he was the law. And today, like every day, he was certain of his invincibility. When the Black family appeared in the park, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A young couple with 2 children, a small boy and a girl barely old enough for school, arrived, hoping to spend the day outdoors. They were, like everyone else, just ordinary people wanting to enjoy the fresh air. But for the guard, their presence felt like a challenge. Standing watch at the main entrance, he noticed them the moment they stepped onto the grounds. A cold, indistinct flicker flashed in his eyes. He couldn't explain why, but he didn't like the idea of them being here. It wasn't about race, he would later tell himself. It was something about them not belonging. And maybe in that moment he felt threatened by their joy, as if it undermined his sense of control. He couldn't have put it into words, but the thought came to him quickly. They don't belong here. They need to leave. As the family spread out, the guard began to make his way over to them. His steps were slow but deliberate, his eyes cold and unwavering. He didn't think they would protest. And they wouldn't have, had it not been for him. But when he reached them, his voice was as harsh as his steps. This is not a place for people like you. The park is closed to your kind. He didn't say anything else. His words were like iron bars closing around the air. To him, it was just an order, but for them, it was an insult. The woman, trying to hide her shock, stood between the children and the guard, as if to shield them from his gaze. The man, standing beside her, slowly turned his head. His look was stern, but beneath it, a shadow of disappointment lingered. "Excuse me, but we're just here to relax," the woman replied, her voice trembling as she tried not to break down. "There's no place for your relaxation here. Get out. This is my park. My rules." The guard's words dripped with contempt, as if he was not saying park, but my kingdom. The woman could hardly believe what was happening. As if her very presence here was a crime, as if she didn't have the right to enjoy the park just like anyone else. But the guard wasn't backing down. His decision was final. And when the man with the children tried to intervene, the guard stepped forward, blocking his path, and spoke with defiance. "You think you're going to teach me something? Get out before I call the police." The woman's heart tightened. She could feel the anger building in her chest, but despite everything, she refused to let herself break. She knew this moment could be pivotal. She couldn't leave without standing up for her right to be here. But the tension in the air was nearly palpable. The whole park seemed to freeze. People started to turn their heads, but no one dared to intervene. Not here. Not now. At that moment, the boy ran up to his mother and whispered, "Mom, are we leaving?" Her eyes filled with pain. She knew she had to comply, to protect her children, but she couldn't hide the tears. She didn't say a word. The guard, satisfied with the scene, stood like a wall, blocking their way. He had no idea that his words would turn into something far greater than a simple complaint or a dispute. He didn't know that this moment would spark a chain of events that would lead him to unimaginable consequences. He thought he was just asserting his dominance over the park and that he would remain untouchable. But at that moment, he was already losing. And he didn't even realize that his arrogance would be his downfall. Minutes passed, but for the woman and her family, time stretched into infinity. When the guard turned and walked away, Oblivious to their silent despair, they felt something heavy, like a weight, hanging in the air. It wasn't just humiliation. It was the sense of injustice, the kind that you can't simply accept. The man silently took his wife's hand, their children, holding back tears, stayed close. He tried to find the right words, but he didn't know what to say. He couldn't believe that this was happening in the 21st century. That in a public place, where people come to relax, his family could be targeted for such degradation. But something in his heart ignited when he looked at his wife and children. He understood that walking away meant admitting defeat, but staying meant being ready to fight for their honor, for their dignity. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "We're going to fight. This isn't the end for us." The woman looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but there was a fire burning in them that she was trying to hide. They both knew that this was not just a personal insult. This was a challenge to something bigger, a fight against a system, against what had been deeply rooted in society. This was more than just an offense to them. It was an attack on their right to exist, to be seen as equals. They began to gather their things, but they didn't rush to leave. The man walked towards the guard, who, standing by his booth, was already enjoying the sense of superiority. "We're not leaving," he said coldly, looking the guard directly in the eye. "You can't just kick us out like this." The guard tilted his head back, sneering at the man. His gaze was filled with the confidence he believed was an unshakable truth. "Didn't you get it? You need to leave. This is my turf. People like you aren't welcome here. I can call the cops. You think anyone will listen to you?" His words hit like a verdict. But the man, despite the fear, didn't back down. He knew this wasn't just one person against another. It was a symbol of the fight against the things hidden in the shadows, the racism that permeated every corner of the city. He couldn't let the guard win. Not today. Meanwhile, the woman, standing beside him, began to search through her bag for her phone. She knew how important it was to be ready, to document every moment, every gesture, every word. She knew that if their story stayed between them and this guard, no one would hear them. But in that moment, the man stepped back, still staring at the guard. He spoke again. "You want us to leave? We're not leaving. And if you think you can humiliate us without consequences, you're wrong. We're going to tell everyone what's happening here." The guard, not accustomed to resistance, hesitated. A flicker of doubt passed across his face, one he quickly tried to conceal. He hadn't expected this family to be so determined, for their silence to become a challenge. "Fine," the guard said, trying to regain his composure, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "You think your words will change anything?" The man held his gaze, unafraid, and his determination only grew stronger. In that moment, when the tension reached its peak, people started to gather. First one, then another. They began to approach the family, stopping nearby, although no one yet knew exactly what they should do. They simply saw how the guard was humiliating these people, how their right to be in the park was taken from them for no reason. The woman, seeing people gathering, felt her heart sink. This was the moment when their story could become something bigger. This was the moment when their struggle could become a symbol. But at that moment, the guard, sensing that the situation was slipping out of his control, pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Yeah, police. We've got a disturbance. I need you to send someone right now." His voice became harsh, almost frantic. However, what he didn't know was even more important. His actions hadn't gone unnoticed. People began recording the incident on their phones, and local activists, who were familiar with these kinds of incidents, started to gather. They weren't going to stay silent. Soon, The situation had escalated far beyond what the guard had expected. When the police arrived, they saw that the situation was much more complicated than simply the request of a guard. The tension continued to build, and none of the participants could turn back now. And now, in this charged atmosphere, the real battle began. A battle not just for justice, but for a future where these moments wouldn't be repeated. The sound of sirens grew louder with each passing second, as the crowd around the family and the guard swelled. What had started as a few curious onlookers soon turned into a group of local activists, friends, and concerned strangers, all drawn in by the growing tension. Whispers spread. Who was this guard? Why was he treating them like this? The air was thick with anticipation and anxiety. The guard, now visibly sweating under the pressure, tried to stand tall, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. His earlier confidence had cracked. He had expected the family to back down quickly, to leave without a fuss. But as the crowd grew, he realized this wasn't just a simple confrontation, it was a battleground for something larger. The woman and her husband exchanged glances. They had already decided. They weren't leaving. And now, with the crowd's presence, they weren't fighting for themselves alone. They were fighting for all those who had ever been silenced by such cruelty. As the police finally arrived, the crowd parted to make room for the officers. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, their sirens cutting through the charged atmosphere. The officers stepped out, their uniforms adding an official weight to the already tense scene. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, surveyed the situation quickly. He looked at the family, then the guard, and then at the crowd. His eyes flicked back and forth, sizing up the situation. The guard, eager to maintain control, immediately stepped forward. "This is a simple matter," he said, his voice shaky, but still filled with arrogance. "These people are causing a disturbance. I told them to leave and they refused. They don't belong here." The officer raised his hand, silencing him, and turned to the family. "What's your side?" The woman spoke first, her voice firm despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "We were simply enjoying our day. We have every right to be here. This man targeted us for no reason other than who we are. He insulted us and humiliated us. We're not going anywhere." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The crowd murmured in agreement. The tension escalated, like a storm ready to break. People were taking sides, and the guard's power was slipping away, replaced by the growing strength of unity. The officer nodded slowly, his face unreadable but changing, shifting from neutrality to something closer to doubt. He turned to his partner, a woman with a stern expression, and they exchanged a brief, silent conversation. After a moment, the officer turned back to the guard. "You're not helping your case," he said bluntly. "If you're accusing them of disturbing the peace, you'd better have something more than your word to back it up." The guard's face reddened. He opened his mouth to protest, but the officer silenced him with a gesture. "We'll be investigating this," the officer said. "For now, step aside and let us handle this." The guard stood rigid, seething with anger and disbelief, but he knew he had lost control. He looked at the gathering crowd, the people now watching him closely, and something inside him shifted. His bravado began to fade. Just as the officer turned to take further statements, the guard spoke again, his voice trembling with frustration. "You can't let them get away with this." His words were desperate. "They're breaking the law. They should be removed." For a moment, everything went still. The officer's gaze snapped back to the guard, his expression hardening. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Enough," the officer said coldly. "We're done here. You'll be hearing from us later." The officers began taking statements from the family and the onlookers while the guard was ushered to the side. The crowd stood in hushed anticipation. The police were now in control of the situation, but what happened next would determine whether the family would be vindicated. Then an onlooker, a man who had been recording the entire encounter, stepped forward, holding his phone high for the officers to see. "This is all on video," he said, his voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crowd. "It's clear who was in the wrong here." The officers exchanged a look and turned their attention to the screen. The video clearly showed the guard's hostile approach, his harsh words, and his clear attempt to escalate the situation. The footage was undeniable. For the first time, the guard seemed small. His entire demeanor deflated. The camera, held by the bystander, was the final blow to his narrative. The officers turned away from him, focusing instead on the evidence that couldn't be denied. The woman exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest beginning to lift. The crowd, which had been anxiously watching, began to applaud quietly. The shift in power was palpable. The park, once a place of tension and division, now became a symbol of resistance. The police reviewed the evidence and took action. The guard was escorted away, his authority shattered, while the family stood tall at the center of a crowd now on their side. The storm had passed, but its effects would be felt for much longer. As the family watched the guard leave, a sense of justice settled into the air. They hadn't just fought for themselves. They had fought for something larger, a future where no one would stand alone against oppression. The crowd dispersed slowly, but this was only the beginning. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The park that had once been a place of peaceful leisure now felt like a battleground of emotions. As the family stood there, watching the guard being escorted away, the atmosphere around them was thick with uncertainty. The applause slowly died down, replaced by hushed whispers. People were still processing what had just transpired. Some had already left, but many stayed, unsure of what to do next. The woman, her hands still tightly gripped by her husband, could feel the eyes of the crowd on them. She knew the tension wasn't over, not by a long shot. She glanced at her children, who had been so quiet, so still during the entire ordeal. She could tell they were still scared, still processing the reality of what had just happened. The husband, his jaw set in determination, finally broke the silence. "We did it," he said, though his voice was laced with both relief and the weight of everything that had just happened. "But this isn't the end." She nodded, her thoughts in sync with his. They had won a small battle, yes, but the larger war had just begun. The guard was gone, but what about the underlying issues, the deep-rooted biases, the systems that allowed such things to happen without consequence? They knew this fight was far from over. As the police officers continued to take statements, the family lingered, still unsure of what would happen next. The officer who had handled the situation approached them again, his expression more serious now. "I'll make sure this gets looked into," he said, his voice calm, but there was something in his tone that felt like an unspoken apology. "But I want to be clear, what you did today matters. You stood up when most people would have backed down." The woman met his gaze, searching his face for sincerity. She had seen enough of these situations to know that promises from authority weren't always followed through, but there was something different in his eyes. Something that made her believe he would try to do the right thing. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling heavier than she'd intended. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but for now, it was enough. The family turned to leave, but as they did, something unexpected happened. The crowd, still gathered in small groups, began to murmur among themselves, their eyes shifting toward the family. Slowly, one by one, people started to approach them. At first, the gestures were small. A nod, a smile, a few words of encouragement. Then a man stepped forward, an older gentleman who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He looked at the woman with kind eyes. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "I've been watching these kinds of things happen for too long. What you did, it matters more than you know." Others followed suit, offering their own words of support, some even expressing anger at what had happened. The realization began to dawn on the family. This moment, this stand against injustice, was resonating with people far beyond just their immediate circle. It wasn't just their fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had been oppressed, silenced, or ignored. But with this realization came a new wave of fear. The guard was gone for now, but what about the system that had allowed him to act the way he did? What about the people who shared his views, who would stop at nothing to maintain their power? As they walked away from the scene, the weight of what had happened started to settle in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the park, but there was no real peace to be found in the fading light. The family knew that this moment would not be the last time they faced opposition. If anything, it was the beginning of something much larger, something that would take them into unknown and dangerous waters. The husband squeezed his wife's hand. "We've started something," he said, his voice firm. "And we're going to finish it." But even as he spoke those words, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, but there was no one there. Still, the sensation lingered, an unsettling presence in the air, a feeling that someone or something was waiting for the right moment to strike. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, the family gathered in the small living room of their apartment. The silence was oppressive, filled with the weight of the day's events. The woman sat down on the couch, her thoughts swirling, but one question kept repeating in her mind. What now? The husband, pacing by the window, finally turned to her. "We need to be ready," he said quietly. "There will be people who want to silence us. People who will try to make us feel small, insignificant. But we have a voice now, and we won't let them take it from us." She nodded, the fire in her chest reigniting. They had come this far. There was no turning back. This was bigger than them now. They had awakened something in the community, a collective sense of resistance that had lain dormant for too long. The road ahead would be dangerous, yes, but they weren't afraid anymore. As they sat in silence, plotting their next steps, the woman's phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend, someone who had been at the park and had witnessed everything. The message read simply, "The guard is back at his post." The tension in her chest tightened once again. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The message lingered on the woman's phone, flashing in the dim light of the living room. "The guard is back at his post." Her heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a wave, crashing into her chest with a force she wasn't ready for. The fight, she thought, was supposed to be over. But it wasn't. It was just beginning. Her husband, who had been pacing, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" She showed him the phone, the message still glowing on the screen. His face tightened as he read it. "He's back?" he muttered. "After everything, he's back?" The weight of it all crashed over them. The man who had humiliated them, who had tried to drive them from the park, hadn't been defeated. He hadn't learned his lesson. He was back in his post, ready to enforce his views, no matter the consequences. The woman stood up suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. There was no time to waste. They couldn't just let this go. They couldn't let him have the last word. Not after everything they had fought for. "We're going back," she said, her voice steady but firm. Her husband didn't argue. He knew this was bigger than just the two of them. It was about taking a stand, not just for their family, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or oppressed. The night was cold as they made their way back to the park. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch with every step they took. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash to unfold. The closer they got to the park, the more the tension in the air became palpable. When they arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. There were no crowds, no activists, no bystanders like before. It was just the park, the dark night, and the faint hum of the city in the distance. The guard was there, standing by the entrance, his uniform sharp against the night. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eye, a coldness that hadn't been there before. He saw them approach, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was heavy, the calm before the storm. The family knew this would be different. There were no more crowds to support them, no more cameras to record every word. It was just them and him, in the heart of the park, with everything on the line. The woman took a step forward, her feet firm on the ground, her voice cutting through the silence. "We're not going anywhere this time," she said. "You can't intimidate us. Not anymore." The guard didn't respond at first, just stared at her with a look of disdain, as if she were beneath him. Then, after a long, suffocating pause, he spoke. "You think you've won?" His voice was low, filled with venom. "You've only made things worse for yourselves." Her husband took a step beside her, his jaw clenched in anger. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his words sharp. "And you're not the law. You don't have the power to control us. Not anymore." The guard's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it might shatter any second. The woman could feel the anger radiating off of him, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. She knew it wouldn't take much to push him over the edge. For a moment, it seemed as if he might attack, as if all his rage would spill out in one violent act. But then, just as quickly, the tension broke. The guard straightened, his expression hardening. "This isn't over," he sneered, taking a slow step back, his gaze never leaving them. "You'll regret this. You'll see. It's not just me you're up against." Before either of them could react, the guard turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the park. The woman's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he disappeared into the shadows, they stood there, watching him go. The fear still clung to them, but it was different now. They had faced him, stood up to him, and they had won. But deep down, they both knew that the real battle was far from finished. Back at home, as they sat down to rest, the weight of the night's events still heavy on their minds, the woman looked out the window at the city beyond. The streets were quiet, but she knew that things had changed. They had ignited something. The ripple effect had started, and it would spread. People were beginning to stand up for what was right, to fight back against the systems that had kept them down for so long. But even as she tried to find peace in that thought, the reality lingered. The guard might have walked away tonight, but there would be others. There would always be others who would try to tear them down. The road ahead would be long, and it would be hard. But they would keep fighting. They had to. And as the night grew darker, they knew this was just the beginning. The storm was far from over. The real battle was yet to come.